My name is Mara Ellington. I was 27 years old when my life changed forever. It started with a text from my father. I had just stepped out of a quiet waterfront cafe, the afternoon sun shimmering across the harbor as I glanced down at my phone. The screen lit up in my hand, revealing a message so short it almost seemed insignificant. "You'll never be anyone important." I read it once, then again. Without saying a word, I slipped the phone back into my pocket. To my own surprise, I didn't cry. After years of hearing disappointment disguised as tough love, I'd grown used to it. My father always insisted that criticism built character. What I learned instead was that it often built silence. Less than 20 minutes later, I swiped my security badge and entered the naval installation where I worked. It felt like any other afternoon. Sailors moved briskly between buildings, conversations drifted through the air, and somewhere beyond the docks, a ship's horn echoed across the water. Everything seemed perfectly ordinary, until it wasn't. A commanding voice suddenly cut through the afternoon. "Admiral on deck." The change was instant. Every conversation stopped. Boots struck the pavement in perfect unison as hundreds of service members snapped to attention. Even the seagulls circling overhead seemed to vanish into the silence. I stopped walking too. Not because an admiral had arrived, because every single person was looking at me. For one impossible moment, time seemed to stand still. My first instinct was to glance over my shoulder, certain someone far more important must be standing behind me. There was no one, just me. A senior commander approached with calm, deliberate steps. His face showed no confusion or hesitation, only quiet confidence. He stopped a respectful distance away, raised a crisp salute, and spoke softly enough that only those nearby could hear. "Welcome back, Admiral." My heart skipped a beat. This had to be a mistake. It had to. But then I noticed the folder tucked beneath his arm. My name was printed across the front. In that instant, my father's message no longer felt like the final chapter of my story. It felt like the beginning of one he never saw coming. I wish I could say I responded with complete confidence, that I returned the salute without a second thought and stepped effortlessly into the role waiting for me. But that's not what happened. I just stood there, staring at the commander, convinced he had mistaken me for someone else. "I think you've got the wrong Elena," I said quietly. A small, knowing smile appeared on his face. It wasn't mocking or surprised, just patient. With practiced care, he opened the folder tucked beneath his arm and laid out documents I hadn't seen in years. The first page held a photograph from a leadership exchange program I'd completed before my current assignment. Beneath it were performance evaluations, recommendations, and a formal letter bearing signatures I recognized immediately. Together, they told the story of years I had rarely spoken about outside official channels. Every late night, every difficult choice, every sacrifice was captured on those pages. "This isn't a mistake," he said calmly. "Some accomplishments have to remain confidential until the time is right." His words landed harder than my father's message ever had. For so long, I'd been chasing approval from someone who had already decided I would never be enough. Somewhere along the way, I'd almost forgotten why I'd pushed myself so relentlessly. It was never about proving him wrong. It was about becoming someone I could look in the eye each morning and genuinely respect. As we crossed the base together, people acknowledged me with quiet professionalism. There was no applause, no grand announcement, no dramatic celebration. Just respectful nods from men and women who understood that real responsibility rarely comes with fanfare. Strangely, that made the moment feel even more meaningful. Inside headquarters, the polished floors reflected the warm afternoon light streaming through the tall windows. The familiar scent of paper, fresh coffee, and salt air lingered in the hallways. It took me back to my very first day there, when I'd arrived carrying little more than determination and the constant feeling that I had something to prove. The commander stopped outside a conference room and turned to face me. "There's one more thing you should know before we begin," he said. He slid a final document into my hands. My eyes dropped to the line marked next of kin. The name there stole my breath. My father. In that moment, I realized he had no idea where life had taken me. or who I had quietly become. Seeing my father's name on that document unsettled me more than I expected. For years, I'd made a deliberate effort to keep my work separate from my family. It wasn't about being secretive, it was about protecting my peace. Every accomplishment I shared was met with another comparison, another reminder that someone else had achieved more, earned more, or mattered more. After a while, I stopped trying. Staying quiet hurt less than chasing approval that was never going to come. The commander noticed the shift in my expression but didn't ask questions. Instead, he simply pointed to the contact information and asked if it was still current. I hesitated for a moment before giving a small nod. As far as I know. The words sounded strangely distant, as if I were talking about someone from another chapter of my life rather than the man who had raised me. The meeting that followed wasn't filled with ceremony or celebration. It was about responsibility. Around the table sat seasoned officers discussing logistics, leadership, and a humanitarian mission that had been months in the making. They listened carefully, asked thoughtful questions, and genuinely considered my perspective. No one made assumptions. No one questioned whether I belonged in the room. Their respect was quiet, the kind that's earned over years of steady work, not handed out because of rank or title. And for the first time in a long while, I stopped wondering whether I deserved to be there. I simply knew I did. That evening, I returned to my apartment overlooking the harbor. City lights danced across the water, while gentle waves lapped against the docks below, filling the silence with a familiar rhythm. I set my phone on the kitchen counter. My father's text was still the last message on the screen. I almost erased it. Instead, I opened an old journal tucked away in a wooden drawer. Between its worn pages was a faded note I'd written to myself years earlier. Keep becoming the person they cannot imagine. A bittersweet smile crossed my face. When I'd written those words, I believed they were about proving someone wrong. Now I understood something different. They were about refusing to let someone else's limited view determine who I could become. I closed the journal gently. Just then, my phone vibrated again. It wasn't my father this time. It was a message from home. Your dad just saw something on the news, and he's asking if it's really you. I didn't reply right away. Instead, I walked to the window and stood looking out over the harbor as evening slowly settled in. The last traces of daylight faded into soft shades of blue and gray, while ships drifted across the water, their lights flickering like distant memories. Behind me, my phone buzzed once on the table, then fell quiet again. For years, I had imagined what I might say if my father ever truly saw me, if he finally recognized the person I'd become. Now that the moment had arrived, I realized I didn't have the words I thought I would. In fact, they didn't seem nearly as important as I'd once believed. A second message lit up the screen. This one was from my aunt. He's been replaying the news for the past hour. He keeps asking if they really said your name. I closed my eyes for a moment. The broadcast itself had been brief. It focused on the humanitarian mission our team was leading and included only a few seconds of footage from the base. There was no dramatic introduction, no personal interview, just a quick shot of me walking into the command building as the reporter mentioned my role. To everyone watching, it was simply another news story. To my family, it was the first glimpse of a version of me they had never bothered to imagine. Memories I hadn't thought about in years surfaced, with startling clarity. I saw my childhood report cards neatly lined up on the kitchen table, waiting for a reaction that never came. I remembered my father barely glancing at them before asking why I hadn't finished first. I thought about the art competition he left early because he was certain I wouldn't win, never knowing my name was announced after he'd already gone. None of those moments had broken me by themselves. But together, they quietly taught me that no matter how hard I worked, I shouldn't expect anyone to notice. Then my phone rang. His name appeared on the screen. For a long moment, I simply stared at it. My heartbeat stayed calm, not because the past no longer mattered, but because it no longer held power over me. At last, I answered. Neither of us spoke. The silence stretched between us until, finally, I heard his voice. It sounded older than I remembered. Softer, too. Elena, he said. Why didn't you ever tell me? I looked out across the dark water before answering. I tried. Silence returned. This time it wasn't awkward, angry, or filled with resentment. It was honest. For the first time in years, neither of us had anything left to hide. And somehow, that quiet moment said more than either of us ever could. The silence stretched on for so long that I wondered if the call had dropped. Then I heard my father let out a slow, unsteady breath, the kind that carries the weight of thoughts too difficult to put into words. "I don't remember," he said quietly. Somehow, those 4 words caught me off guard more than an apology ever could have. "You probably don't," I replied gently. "For you, they were just ordinary conversations. For me, they became the words I carried every time I doubted myself." Neither of us raised our voices. There was no anger left to defend, no argument waiting to happen. It was simply 2 people looking back at the same past from completely different perspectives. In that moment, I realized something I'd never fully understood before. He had never truly seen the impact his words had on me. What he intended to say, and what I lived with for years were 2 very different things. The next morning, before leaving for the base, I opened an old storage box that had followed me through every move. Inside were faded certificates, worn notebooks, and a small wooden compass my mother had given me when I was a teenager. I picked it up carefully, running my thumb along its weathered edges. I could still hear her voice as clearly as if she were standing beside me. "Whenever people make you doubt yourself, don't borrow their direction. Find your own." A quiet smile crossed my face. The compass had aged over the years, its edges softened by time, yet somehow it had survived every chapter of my life, just as I had. Later that afternoon, another message arrived from my aunt. "Your father has been going through old photo albums. He keeps stopping at pictures of you. I don't think he's searching for memories anymore. I think he's searching for the moments he never truly saw." I stared at the message for a long time. To my surprise, I didn't feel a sense of victory. There was no satisfaction in imagining his regret. Only a quiet understanding that one of life's hardest truths isn't discovering who someone else really is. Sometimes, it's realizing you never truly saw the person who had been standing beside you all along. And for the first time, I had the feeling that both of us were finally ready to face that truth together. A week passed before I finally agreed to go home. The drive felt longer than I remembered. Familiar roads wound through neighborhoods where every street corner held a memory. The old bakery was still opening its doors before sunrise, just as it always had. The park where I'd learned to ride a bicycle looked almost unchanged, except the trees had grown taller, their branches stretching wider across the paths. Time had moved on, yet somehow, parts of the past had stayed exactly where I'd left them, quietly waiting. When I stepped through the front door, the familiar scent of freshly brewed tea and polished wood greeted me. The house looked almost exactly as it had when I was growing up, but something had shifted. The silence felt different. It no longer carried the weight of tension. It carried uncertainty. My father was sitting at the dining table. For the first time I could remember, he didn't speak the moment I walked in. Instead, he slowly stood, reached for a worn cardboard box, and gently placed it in front of me. "I found these in the attic," he said. I lifted the lid. Inside were pieces of a life I'd almost forgotten, school essays, certificates, newspaper clippings, and photographs I thought had disappeared years ago. Everything had been carefully bundled together with a faded blue ribbon, as though someone had wanted to preserve those memories, even if they'd been hidden away. My father picked up one of the papers. It was a letter I'd written as a teenager, describing my dream of serving something greater than myself. "I read this again last night," he said quietly. "I don't know how I forgot what mattered so much to you." I ran my fingertips across the page. The handwriting was uneven, filled with hope, determination, and the uncertainty that comes with believing in a future you can't yet see. I barely recognized the girl who had written those words, yet I could still feel her quiet resolve. My father looked down for a moment before speaking again. "I spent so much time trying to make you stronger," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "that I never stopped to realize you already were." His words settled gently into the silence between us. There was no dramatic apology capable of erasing the years behind us. Some wounds don't disappear after a single conversation, and some stories can't be rewritten overnight. But for the first time, neither of us was trying to defend the past. We were simply telling the truth. And somehow, that truth felt like the beginning of something neither of us had expected. Not victory, not redemption, just the quiet possibility of peace. The weeks that followed didn't change our family overnight. There was no dramatic reconciliation, no single conversation that magically healed the years between us. I came to realize that healing rarely announces itself the way heartbreak does. It arrives quietly, almost unnoticed, revealing itself in small moments that most people would probably overlook. My father began calling once a week, not to question my decisions or compare me to someone else, but simply to ask how I was doing. At first, those conversations felt a little awkward. We talked about ordinary things, the weather, books we'd been reading, the harbor outside my apartment. Sometimes long stretches of silence settled between us. Years earlier, those quiet moments would have made me uneasy. Now, they felt like something else entirely. They gave us space to think, to listen, and to speak without the pressure of living up to expectations. One Saturday, he asked if he could visit the naval base during a public family appreciation event. I hesitated. Then I said yes. When he arrived, he walked beside me without trying to direct the day or make himself the center of it. As we moved through the base, service members greeted me with the same quiet respect I'd come to appreciate over the years. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed my father watching. This time, there was no disbelief in his expression, only quiet attention. He listened as my colleagues spoke about my leadership, my calm under pressure, and the trust they placed in me. He didn't interrupt. He didn't question what they said. He simply listened. Later, as we walked along the waterfront, the evening sun scattered golden light across the calm water. We stopped for a while, watching the gentle movement of the waves. After a long silence, he finally spoke. "I spent years believing that importance was something people announced," he said softly. "Today I realized it's something you earn when no one is watching." I smiled. Not because I'd finally heard the words I'd once longed for, but because, for the first time, I could hear real understanding behind them. For so many years, I'd imagined this moment as the finish line, the end of a struggle I'd carried for most of my life. Instead, it felt like the beginning of something entirely different. A relationship no longer built on impossible expectations, but on honesty, humility, and the quiet courage to truly see one another. There was only one conversation left before I could finally leave the past where it belonged. A few days later, my father asked if we could meet one more time before I returned to the base. We chose a quiet bench overlooking the harbor, the same stretch of water where it had once felt as though my life had divided into two separate chapters. A cool afternoon breeze carried the scent of salt and approaching rain, and for a while we simply sat together, watching the waves drift toward the shore. Neither of us felt the need to break the silence. After everything we'd been through, silence was no longer something to fear. Eventually, my father reached into his jacket and pulled out my very first school photograph. Its corners were worn with age, and a small tear had been carefully repaired with a strip of clear tape years before. "I've kept this all these years," he said quietly. I looked at it countless times, but I never really saw the little girl smiling back at me. His words stung. Not with the sharp pain I'd carried for so long, but with the quieter ache that comes when an old wound is finally exposed to the light instead of hidden away. He lowered his eyes before speaking again. "I can't take back the things I said," he admitted. "That message, those words, they came from my own fears, not from the truth about who you are. If I could erase them, I would." I looked down at the photograph. The little girl smiling into the camera had spent years believing she needed someone else's permission to matter. She never had. Gently, I placed the picture back in his hand. "You don't have to erase the past," I said. "Just don't repeat it, with me or with anyone else who needs your encouragement more than your judgment." He looked at me for a long moment, then nodded. His eyes reflected a quiet understanding that words alone could never fully express. When it was time to leave, there was no dramatic embrace or perfect ending that suddenly made everything right. Life rarely works that way. Instead, We walked back toward the parking lot side by side, two people carrying the same history but no longer seeing it through the same lens. On the drive back to the base, my phone lit up one last time. A message from my father. "I'm proud of the woman you've become. I should have told you years ago." I read it once. Then I smiled, set the phone beside me, and kept driving without feeling the need to reply immediately. Because at last, I understood something that had taken me 27 years to learn. Your worth is never created by someone else's approval. It grows quietly through integrity, compassion, and the courage to keep becoming who you are, even when the people you love can't yet recognize your value. The words that had once tried to define my future no longer held any power over me. Not because I'd won a battle, not because anyone had lost, but because I'd finally stopped believing them. And in that quiet freedom, I found the only victory that had ever truly mattered. Some of life's greatest victories don't come with applause, recognition, or impressive titles. They happen quietly, in the moment you stop letting someone else's opinion determine your worth. For years, I believed my father's words would define my future. In time, I realized they didn't define me at all. They simply reminded me that our value is never measured by another person's doubts, but by the integrity, resilience, and compassion we choose to build when no one is watching. If this story resonated with you, I'd truly appreciate it if you gave this video a like, subscribed to the channel, and shared it with someone who may need this reminder today. And before you go, I'd love to hear from you in the comments. What's one belief about yourself that you refuse to let someone else take away? Your story could be exactly the encouragement another person needs to read today.